Gahahaha! We are back with yet another Rance video. Today we'll be looking at the often overlooked Rance VI, the Collapse of Zeth. Alicesoft famously had some troubles with the previous game, trying and failing to live up to the scope of Kichikuou Rance, the now-retconned finale to the Rance series, but ultimately scrapped their first 3 attempts and eventually just pushed out what's essentially a short side story as Rance V, though it did introduce a few important characters and served as a soft reboot for the series. But it was Rance VI where they finally started ramping up the scope of these games again, and this game has a lot of content and story, and I'm gonna talk about it. But first, a quick explanation for those of you new to the Rance series and new to the channel. Rance is a series of 18+ games by Japanese developer Alicesoft. The idea is to parody the fantasy RPG genre, and they did that by making the titular protagonist Rance an awful, terrible person who just so happens to also be hilarious. He's violent, narcissistic, entitled, and notably will end up struggle snuggling the women around him when he feels like it. Read between the lines with that one. I can't say the actual word this early in the video. But while the series started out as pure parody, it eventually developed into a genuinely great story with genuinely great characters while still maintaining its goofy tone. And honestly, this series just gets better and better as it goes on. The writing seriously shot up in quality around Rance 3 and 4, Kichikuou Rance is one of the best 90s strategy games out there, and Rance 6, well, it's my favorite Rance game so far, both for its gameplay and its story. Another defining feature of the Rance games is that each one has a different core gameplay system, and part of the excitement of picking up each entry in the series is you don't necessarily know what you're gonna get. Well, Rance VI branches out in yet another direction for the series as a 3D tile-based dungeon crawler with more or less traditional JRPG turn-based battle system. On top of this, much of the story progression outside of dungeon crawling is done via an interesting menu-based system in the hub, and I don't think I've seen anything quite like it. Real quick before I go into details, there is a free patch for the game known as the TADA Patch. It was made by the game's director, and it reduces a lot of the grind alongside a host of other quality of life changes. I played with the patch installed, and the things I say about the game will be in reference to the patched version of Rance VI. And by the way, I highly recommend installing the patch. I'll explain why later on. Also, the beginning of this video will be completely spoiler-free. I'll give a big obvious warning when that changes, so don't worry if you haven't played the game for yourself yet. So here's the basic gameplay loop. Rance and his party traverse this game's various dungeons. You can gain adventure points by beating the random combat encounters and collecting pickups that'll spawn semi-randomly throughout the dungeon. At various point thresholds, you'll gain rewards, including gold, items, and the 3 types of orb which I'll talk about shortly. Upon completing the mission objective, reaching an exit tile, or simply warping out via the escape option, you return to the main base area. Here you can do pretty much every non-dungeon thing, such as leveling up, saving the game, visiting the shop, and equipping your party. You can also spend those orbs you got on events. Each orb type mainly correlates to a specific type of event you can use it on, and you can carry up to 3 of each at any one time. The red crab orbs are mostly used for general story content, including unlocking missions. Always remember to save a crab orb after you complete a mission, or you're gonna have to go back out for a bit of grinding. The yellow monkey orbs are used mostly for H content, which in this game can be used to give minor buffs to Rance and his allies, and to raise the level cap of the various party members. Amusingly, you can also spend an orb for Rance to masturbate, at which point Mikan will appear and give Rance a buff out of pity. And lastly, the blue eagle orbs are the rarest, and are primarily used to unlock various abilities and unique buffs for Rance and his party. Some events will require multiple of a certain orb, or even multiple types of orbs. So this orb system is something you're going to be dealing with from the very beginning of the game, right up until you pretty much 100% the game. Everything that matters will require orbs, and you'll need a shitload of them when all is said and done. And you will want to get these events done, as each one will typically give you something as a reward beyond just story content, be it a new mission, an item, or raising a character's FR level. FR is an alternative progression system for every character in the game besides Rance, and in canon, it loosely represents the character's bond with Rance. You can raise a character's FR by finding one of their FR raising events in a dungeon, by viewing certain events at the base, and by using a present on them. At various FR thresholds, you can give them new abilities and buffs, some of which are absolutely crucial to your success moving forward. Additionally, in order to get the true ending, and I would recommend making that your initial goal, you're gonna have to max out the FR of most of the characters you end up recruiting. So before we've even gotten to the actual combat mechanics of the game, we have something really interesting in terms of game design. Never let it be said that Alicesoft don't think outside the box, because this unique orb and FR system is essentially a mutation of a typical RPG side quest system. Rance VI does have a handful of actual side quests, but the overwhelming majority of side progression is done by passively chipping away at events and FR boosts. The neat thing about this is it lets you pursue the side content without pulling you away from the main story. One issue I have when it comes to side quests in video games, and this spans across genres by the way, is that they kind of fuck with the pacing of the story, and oftentimes the gameplay. See, if they're important, you generally want to make the effort to complete them. Yeah, because rewards, but also because they can expand on story and world building. Characters can get extra story arcs. You can influence the world in other ways. But in order to experience this content, you typically have to put the driving plotline on hold. If you're enjoying the main story, having to force yourself away from it can keep you from fully enjoying the side content, as it feels like a barrier between you and the content you were already enjoying. And if there's some sort of narrative tension, dipping out to do something else for an extended period of time can completely kill your immersion, because it becomes obvious that no, there isn't any actual urgency and the danger will not come to pass until you let it. But Rance VI does it differently. As you're doing main story stuff, you'll gather orbs passively, and in between dungeon runs, you'll get a drip feed of side content. You get to experience a handful of events that make sense as taking place in between dungeon runs. This content naturally stretches out for the entire game, since you can only view a couple of events after each dungeon due to the orb limit. And because it never pulls you away from the main story for very long, because you can experience it through the same core gameplay that you've probably grown to love, because it's an ever-present companion to your gameplay journey that feels like the world and the characters are evolving naturally alongside the main plot, I love the side stories of Rance VI in a way I rarely get to see in these kinds of big ambitious games. In most of the games I've played where I like the side content, it's either the defining experience like in an Elder Scrolls game, or it ends up just being a case of it's better than not having it, but not as good as the main game. With Rance VI, it supplemented the story and drove me to keep pushing through the game, even if a certain dungeon was frustrating or a certain story segment wasn't really doing it for me. I never had the chance to get too burned out on the dungeon crawling, at least not until the grind for the true ending, which I'll talk about later, because it was always broken up by funny and interesting scenes back at the base. I never got burned out on the side stories because I could only do a few before it got broken up by more dungeon crawling. I understand that this system is not something that's going to necessarily click with every single one of you, and honestly, had I played the original unpatched version of the game, I probably would have hated it because it was not balanced properly. But I want you to at least acknowledge that this is an interesting take on distributing side content to the player, and it kept me personally engaged from start to finish. Okay, so now that we're probably like 8 minutes into the video, let's actually talk about the main gameplay loop. When you set out into a dungeon, you can build a party of 6 out of whatever active members of your unit you have available to you. Whoever you don't pick will be available as a reserve unit, and as long as you're not in combat, you can swap members in and out as much as you'd like while in a dungeon. Each dungeon does have an FR requirement, meaning anyone without enough FR will not be able to be a part of your party, though standard gameplay will typically result in most of your units being available for most dungeons. Between your active and reserve party members, you can have a maximum of 16 units at any one time, including Rance himself. When you have more than that, you'll have to swap one or more of them out at the base, where they will, for all intents and purposes, not exist until you swap them back in. The dungeons themselves are a 3D dungeon crawl meant as an homage to the old school 3D RPGs. You can explore these to your heart's content for goodies. In contrast to a more typical 2D dungeon crawler, Rance VI utilizes elevation a lot in its exploration, and you'll regularly come across staircases that'll bring you to different levels, which results in many dungeons being much larger than they initially appear. And I will say that for the most part, these dungeons are pretty densely packed with stuff. As you explore, you can find chests which can contain anything from money, to items, to orbs, events which will give you a short bit of dialogue followed by a +1 FR to a party member, and adventure point pickups. Now, adventure points are how Rance VI handles the RPG loot grind. See, when you kill monsters, you actually only get XP and adventure points. No money, no items. At various adventure point thresholds, you'll gain rewards specific to the dungeon you're in. This is the primary way to obtain orbs and money, and adventure points reset upon leaving a dungeon. With each step, you can get a random enemy encounter, resulting in a fight as is JRPG standard. It's also worth noting that your entire party, including reserve units, gain XP from each combat, even if they're knocked out. There are 3 varieties of colored doors in some dungeons, which can only be opened with an identically colored key. These keys can be bought at the camp for a scaling gold cost depending on how many keys you currently own. These doors can sometimes be blocking goodies, some unlock shortcuts, and some are straight up red herrings that get you nothing. And you can also find big glowing red balls on some stages. Walk into them to trigger a fight that's usually pretty tough relative to the rest of the dungeon. Beat it, and most of the time you'll get a red coupon which can be spent at a special stop for stuff like orbs and other goodies. Most red balls despawn after beating them, but some don't for certain reasons that make sense when you see them in context. And that's the basics of exploration. I got stuff to talk about, but I think I should explain a bit more of the fundamentals first. So here's how combat works. For starters, every unit including Rance has a resource called SP. At a glance, you may have assumed that this was a mana system, but that's wrong. There is no mana system in Rance VI. It's stamina. Entering combat costs 1 SP, and when a unit hits 0 SP, once the combat ends, you'll get a short dialogue blurb and they'll leave your party as if they've been knocked out. Battles are in a fairly traditional turn-based JRPG format, with up to 3 frontline units and up to 3 backline units. Frontline versus backline is really simple. As long as there's at least one unit in the frontline, the backline cannot use or be targeted by most melee attacks. Each unit has their own abilities that give them a unique role in your party. For example, Rance is a frontline fighter whose focus is on dealing heavy melee damage with his high base attack and Rance attack ability. Sill is a backline mage who acts as a hybrid battle mage and healer, restoring HP to the party and launching a couple of basic fire and ice spells at the enemies. She doesn't particularly excel at either, but she can adapt to whatever you need her for. Or one character who I won't name because spoilers, who acts as a frontline tank. He has one of the highest base defense stats of any playable character and has a passive taunt ability, forcing an enemy to attack him instead of one of the squishier party members. So as you might expect, the battles play out with each combatant taking their turn, with the order being dictated partly by the unit's speed stat and partly by RNG. On its turn, a unit can use any of their available abilities by hovering the mouse on the ally or enemy that's to be targeted. Some abilities require 1 to 2 turns of charge before they can be used. If those abilities are selected, the character will attempt to go Super Saiyan and automatically do their thing on their next move. That being said, both allies and enemies have a chance to completely lose their charge upon taking damage, so there's a bit of risk there. But of course, there is a reward to go along with that risk. For an easy example, any charge ability that just deals damage will always do more than 2 turns of a standard attack. And of course, other charge abilities will have additional benefits to justify it. On top of standard abilities, all allied units have 4 additional commands. Wait will simply skip that unit's turn. Serious mode will drain that unit's SP to 0, but will give a massive self buff in exchange. This one's very useful for boss fights since you'll be leaving afterwards anyway. Withdrawal will have that unit dip out as if they've been knocked out, meaning they will not be available again until you leave the dungeon. And lastly, there's Call, which will allow you to pull units from your reserves into your active party. So while you can easily replace lost units outside of combat, you do have to sacrifice 1 unit's turn whenever you want to do it in combat. And it's worth noting that if all 6 of your party slots get knocked out in combat, it's game over, even if you have 10 more units sitting back and ready to go. And in Rance 6, game over means game over. It'll kick you back to the main menu, so please do save before every dungeon attempt. In addition to you being able to call in reserves, some enemy encounters will feature more than 6 enemies as well, with new units spawning as soon as space opens up for them. It's also worth noting that some enemy units take up more than 1 space, so that can influence how and when certain things spawn in. This adds an interesting dynamic to combat encounters because once you kind of know how everything goes, you can actually use your spawn knowledge to your advantage. For example, if you know that only 2 space enemies will be spawning, you can strategically take out the other enemies so that they can't fit, reducing the numbers you need to fight at one time. Or if you know that a big threat will spawn in next, you can take the time to weaken all the enemies so you can take them out quickly once the big baddie spawns. In some cases, you can manipulate things so that an enemy will spawn in the front line instead of the back line, opening them up to attacks from your own frontliners. To be clear, this is not some kind of crazy hyper-strategic gameplay mechanic, but what it is interesting, something I don't really see anywhere else. It makes me think about the game in a slightly different way, and there's something about that that really endears Rance 6 to me. It offers an experience that's not necessarily better or worse than other JRPGs, but is an experience wholly unique from them. So the core foundations of Rance 6's gameplay are fairly simple when you really think about it. I mean, aside from a couple of quirks here and there, the combat mirrors typical JRPG fare. And as much as I like talking about the game mechanics and how the little things all affect gameplay, and don't worry, I'll be talking about some of that stuff in a bit, the thing that really struck me when I sat down to really think about how I wanted to approach this video is actually something I've noticed about Alicesoft games as a whole. Granted, I have not played every single game they've ever made, but I have played 11 of their games across 3 IPs, and what I'm about to say applies to every single Alicesoft game I've played. Alicesoft games aren't always the best, and there's almost always at least one major criticism I can levy. And while I loved Rance 6, you'll definitely hear some criticisms. But what these games are is innovative down to their very core. Whether they end up as a top-tier JRPG like Evanikal or a dumpster fire with funny writing like the original Rance 1, they always attack their chosen genre from an angle that I have never seen before. I've never seen a game that has you spend your equipment to do combat like Rance 01. I've never seen anything quite like Rance 6's orb system. Hell, Sengoku Rance inspired a fucking subgenre of grand strategy games like Eiyu Senki and Eroto Hokei, and yes, I will cover those eventually because I know my audience will appreciate it. I already said this on Twitter, but Alicesoft games are what you get if you describe the genre of game to a gifted programmer who had never heard of that type of game before. Because that programmer has no preconceived notions and no working knowledge of standard practices, you end up with a game that definitely bears some resemblance to the genre, but gets there in a completely different way. Rance VI did, in many ways, feel very familiar. The battle system has that JRPG feel that gets me excited about the genre as a whole. The exploration bears a lot of resemblance to a lot of the early 3D PC games. But despite those similarities, it's very much distinct from them and creates an entirely new and unique experience. And that's something that I continue to appreciate about Rance, especially now that the games are finally getting good, because we all know that wasn't always the case. But while Rance VI is an interesting and genuinely great game, it does hold on to some of that Rance jank because that's become a signature component of the Rance series. And one thing I really have to point out is that the balance of the game is absolutely fucking awful without the TADA Patch. While there are a ton of little bug fixes and minor QOL updates that are nice but don't ultimately amount to much, there are a few changes that quite frankly make this game bearable. For starters, XP and adventure point gains are straight up doubled. Don't get me wrong, those orbs are still a grind and a half, but this cuts out hours upon hours of pointless, tedious grind. The grace period after combat has been doubled so that you'll deal with fewer random encounters overall, making it a bit easier to traverse dungeons without being whittled down to nothing. Don't forget that the SP system hard caps the number of random encounters you can handle in a single outing, so this change lets you explore for longer. The map updates in a 3x3 radius of the player instead of the original 1, which cuts down on a lot of pointless movement just to fill out the map for completion rewards. One of the post-game dungeons originally had a gauntlet of somewhat challenging red ball fights before the fairly difficult boss fight. Not awful on its own, but in the unpatched version, they respawn upon leaving the dungeon, which makes the boss go from challenging to fucking ridiculous, since those red ball fights will hurt you a good amount unless you're overleveled. They don't respawn with the patch. And the last change I'm going to mention, and again, there are a bunch more, is that in the post-game you can buy presents with the assloads of spare cash you'll have, which can be used to instantly gain +1 FR to anyone you want. In the patched version, these presents are 1/6 the price. And trust me, you'll want to be buying presents because the alternative is an annoying level of orb grinding. The thing that I find really interesting about all this is that the biggest issue with Rance VI on release was the balance, which to be clear fucking nuked the overall pacing of the game and made it an absolute slog to get through. But that got fixed primarily by tweaking the numbers. I need to drive this point home. The biggest problems with Rance VI, which is a genre that the developers were unfamiliar with, was more or less solved without the need for any systemic changes. The mechanisms of the game that did change in the TADA patch were really just minor quality of life things or adjustments to isolated segments of the game. The actual fixes that made this game substantially better were just replacing one set of numbers with another. Yes, they did mess up on release, but the foundation was there, and it was good. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier. Of the Alicesoft games I've played, of which admittedly most are Rance games, I can consistently say that the developers are quite talented, but they make mistakes that are clearly born out of a lack of experience with the type of game they're making. It's something I really don't see all that often, and it really does fascinate me. But all that being said, I did of course play the game with the TADA patch, and overall I found the general pace and progression of the game to be pretty solid. Very little grinding of any kind was necessary until the post-game, with the vast majority of my orbs and experience coming from just clearing enemy encounters as I worked my way through the story. I never felt underleveled for any particular challenge, and the only real grind sessions I ever had before the first set of credits rolled were when I needed a red orb to accept a new mission because the previous dungeon didn't give me one, or I stupidly spent it, or when I had a bunch of party members at their talent cap, which is really just a level cap. See, the way it works is that each character has a cap on total experience gains that the game doesn't tell you about until they hit it. Fortunately, Rance's cap is canonically infinite, and he can transfer some of that via sex. So you can spend orbs on capped party members, Rance will fuck them, and their cap will go up. There's also a hard cap, after which sex will only provide minor stat boosts. So there were times when one inventory of orbs wasn't enough, and I felt like I would be wasting XP, so I would go out on a quick little grind session to uncap a few more party members before letting the story be my grind. And look, I know that some degree of grind is pretty much a staple of the JRPG genre, but I've never been a fan. Let me level up by playing the damn game, rather than having to wipe the floor with a bunch of trash mobs. And I definitely appreciated Rance VI for the fact that the grind was never really something I had to get into as I was progressing the story. And the few times where grind was either necessary or I felt it was optimal, the sessions were effectively time limited by the fact that I could only hold 3 of each orb. So none of the grinding ever lasted long enough to actively bore me. At least not until the post-game, but again, I'll get into that a bit later. being able to continually progress through the game without stopping definitely helped me power through this game without burning out, which I know from experience is something I'm susceptible to when I'm trying to brute force a game for the channel. Octopath Traveler fucking broke me. A big part of the combat of Rance 6 ends up being about identifying, prioritizing, and dealing with threats. See, the game doesn't just throw a random selection of enemies at you for random encounters. It has a number of set enemy configurations for each dungeon, so there's often a theme there. And more often than not, you'll have cases where certain enemies are the ones you need to deal with ASAP, and others are either minor nuisances or are designed specifically to support the real threats. One obnoxious enemy encounter involves 3 enemies in the front line who can't attack but have a taunt ability that will essentially redirect any non-magical single-target attack. Of course, they're accompanied by a tough suite of backliners who can make your life hell. So the strategy there is either to DPS the frontliners down as quickly as possible, or use a combination of magic and AoE to kill the actual threats. You'll frequently come across enemy configurations with 1 or 2 backliners with a devastating charge ability, so you've got to target them first or interrupt them when they charge. One enemy is incredibly weak at the start of battle, but will transform a few turns in and become very deadly, so you've got to choose whether to hit them early on and potentially delay killing the other enemies who are often dangerous enough in their own right, or try to abuse those few turns of safety to deal with the others and then try to get the kill before it transforms. There's a lot of this kind of thing throughout Rance 6, and overall I did like it. You don't tend to stick to one dungeon for very long, so you're always encountering something new and it never got too monotonous. Where this falls apart a bit is in the boss encounters, particularly in the mid to late game and especially in the post game. And the reason for this is very simple. Stun abilities in Rance 6 are kind of overpowered and they absolutely dictate the balance of the game as you unlock more of them. There are a few reasons that stuns are just incredibly good. For starters, it'll obviously make an enemy skip a turn, which is going to be strong in any turn-based game. It also cancels any charge the enemy might have, giving it a bit of a 2-for-1 kind of deal. But even then, if the stun fails, the hit itself has a chance to interrupt a charge. And that's not to mention that multiple units gain access to easy stun abilities that are practically asking to be spammed. In particular, Kaloria and Kanami both have ranged stun abilities with no charge time. Unless you've got a golden opportunity to outright kill an enemy or everything else is already stunned, there is no reason not to use that in a fight. It's just straight up too good. Even Rance himself can unlock a talent that gives his Rance attack a stun chance, as if Rance attack wasn't already stupid good. On top of this, there are no systems in place to prevent stun locking. If RNG favors you, there is nothing stopping you from stunning an enemy every single turn, including bosses. In fact, stun strats were my go-to for every post-game fight because it's just better than anything else I could have done. While it was fun, I am left wondering whether or not it hurt my overall experience. When one course of action is blatantly better than any other, it does tend to kill experimentation within a game, as people do tend to optimize the fun out of video games at any given opportunity. And towards the end of the game, I was definitely approaching at least the difficult fights with the sense of, go in with a bunch of stunners to disable the biggest threat. And that strategy did not change at its core. Of course, I would have to adjust things on the fly in case one of my units got one-tapped or an enemy got a big AoE off, but the underlying strategy never really changed. I guess I just can't help but wish there were other equally viable approaches to tough fights. And also, the whole stun thing made certain fights very susceptible to RNG. If my stun luck just wasn't there, that would be a guaranteed loss at times, especially for the post-game bosses, which tend to have big AoE attacks that can completely wreck the glass cannons. But while I don't think the combat of Rance 6 is perfect, it was good enough to easily hold my interest for the entire main story and was even still fun as I was grinding out the post-game. Considering that it's a thing that you'll be doing a lot of over the course of a lot of hours, that's pretty solid. One area that I found to be a general weakness of the game is something that's kind of become a staple of the Rance games in my experience. The UI and the general way that information gets delivered to the player can be a little rough at times. You'll have to go into a specific menu in order to use presents on your party that's different from the menu that lets you give presents to the non-combatant NPCs, which led me to believe for quite some time that it was just something that was locked off until later. Descriptions of what individual abilities can do can only be viewed outside of dungeons in a specific menu. Annoying enough on its own, but when you're learning new abilities, you kinda have to guess what they do based on their names because you can't view the description until you've already committed an orb. The shop UI just isn't very good, and for some reason I just completely missed the fact that you could buy keys there for a while. The game does not tell you when a character hard caps their talent level, meaning it's very easy to waste an orb on a minor stat buff because you didn't realize that that was it for them. Some of the actual side quests you do can be fairly cryptic, and not in a fun puzzle to figure out way, but in a gotta Google this shit way. Like, one character requires you to find a specific item in a dead end in a dungeon and bring it to another place in the dungeon. Nowhere does it tell you that you need to do this, though you can figure it out on your own, after you grab the item. Yeah, I had to look that one up. Certain side quests will reveal themselves in a dialogue and not be mentioned again until you do the thing you need to do. So I hope you remember that dialogue if you decide to do other stuff for a while. This kind of thing is unfortunate, but it's what I've come to expect from Rance at this point. Every title I've played so far, including genuinely great ones like Kichikuou Rance, have had these little quirks that threaten to give me a fucking aneurysm. But honestly, the negatives of Rance 6 for the most part don't really drag down the overall experience, and most of them only amount to a moderate inconvenience until you figure that particular thing out. And overall, getting through the main story as well as the primary post-game story content was an absolute pleasure. One staple part of the Rance series, at least as far as I've played up to this point, is the Galmons. For the uninitiated, the monsters in the Rance universe come in two varieties: the male Gaimons, who more or less act as your typical JRPG cannon fodder, and the Galmons, who are fuckable. Yeah, that's pretty much been the joke since their introduction, and ever since Rance 3, most of the games have featured some sort of system surrounding them. In Rance 6, this is the capture and training system. Pretty early on, you'll unlock a character who likes to train Galmons in a way that more or less amounts to a horny and crazy version of Pavlov. From there, you'll have access to a capture ability. Rance has a version that requires a one-turn charge, and this new character has a version with no charge time, though the trade-off is that this guy sucks as a combatant. When you use capture on a Galmon, there's a success chance based on their remaining HP. Much like Pokemon, you'll want to weaken the Galmons before you try to nab them. With each unique Galmon, you'll be able to review an event that'll give you a new dirty CG and some FR with the new character. Perfectly functional system, though it can be pretty tedious if you want to catch them all. Which brings me to the postgame. That oh so lovely postgame. See, after you beat the main story, there's still plenty more to do. There is some additional story content, which mostly revolves around tying up a few loose ends, but there's also the ending. There's the default ending, where the game will basically say, hey dipshit, you should probably go do more stuff, but there's also a true ending. Here's what's required to unlock it. Complete all missions. Pretty obvious, but there are multiple post-game quest lines that you'll need to wrap up, and some of them can be fairly lengthy and or tricky. View all optional events. Yeah, you're gonna have to get your orb grind on. Obtain all S-rank weapons. Basically, some characters will have a short quest you need to go on to upgrade their weapon from A rank, which you can get in the shop, to S rank. You're gonna have to do all of them. Max out the FR on all important characters. Luckily, there are a bunch of characters who either don't stick around until the very end, or just straight up don't need to be maxed out, but you'll still need to max out 15 characters. Keep in mind that most of them have FR caps with some sort of requirement to raise them, be it a specific event or a short side quest. You're probably going to want to spam presents for a good chunk of this requirement. Catch all Galmons. Yep, not getting away from this one. One of the dungeons does get updated in the postgame to allow all Galmon types to spawn, but that only does so much. The true ending is a grind, and I can only imagine how much it must have sucked before the TADA Patch existed. It was at this point where my love for the game started to wane a bit. Getting through all the missions was always a blast. Great fun all around, but grinding out those tedious additional requirements was just painful. Yes, I needed to do dedicated orb grinds. I spent several hours just grinding random encounters to clean up the Galmons I didn't manage to grab along the way, including the Lil Runaway, who as the name implies, fucking runs away, making her incredibly obnoxious. I was absolutely swimming in cash, but buying presents very quickly nuked my funds, requiring me to actually go out and grind for more. I had to do a bunch of little side quests which could really not justify their own existence. I'm not gonna lie, I burned out a little towards the end, and it left a sour taste in my mouth after an otherwise really fun game. But in exchange for all that time and effort, I was able to see the true ending for myself, and it was not fucking worth it. Yeah, it was better than the default ending, but it in no way justifies all the bullshit you have to go through to unlock it. I'll go into more detail in the story section of this video because it would obviously be a spoiler, but what I will say right now is that it was extremely anticlimactic. But wait, there's more. Yeah, there's actually still some post-game content that isn't required for the true ending, mainly a handful of super bosses. These guys hit hard and are really just there for bragging rights and a CG as a reward for going the extra mile. I already talked about the boss fights in general earlier in the video, and I really don't have much more to add for these guys. Additionally, there's Madness Mode, which changes the game in a few ways. Enemies get tougher, characters who left the group for story reasons all become available again, and talent caps get lifted. Madness Mode also unlocks the Fiend Squad, which is a deliberately unbalanced boss gauntlet designed to be as difficult and ridiculous as possible. No, I did not do it myself. I just don't have it in me to grind enough to even stand a chance. There are no tangible rewards for it regardless. It's really only there for people who want to be pushed to their limits. I, however, was well and truly done with the game by the time I got the true ending. So So overall, on a gameplay level, Rance VI is a pretty solid dungeon crawling JRPG, and with the TADA Patch fixing the most egregious balance and quality of life issues, it's a fun time all around. You'll always be pushing towards that next objective, and the combat itself is very satisfying. And there's a ton of content, which ends up being both a blessing and a curse. It was wonderful to spend all that time on the main story, and the little side events were always something to look forward to thanks to the always hilarious Rance writing. But there's also a decent amount of content for content's sake, and seeing as the true ending requires you to complete the majority of it, it just becomes a slog. I know earlier I said that I recommend making the true ending your goal, but I think the best path is to start out with the goal of obtaining the true ending, because that'll make you play in a certain way where you're actively trying to do things, like view optional events and capture new Galmons, and the game really does benefit from that approach. Like, I'll be honest, if capturing Galmons wasn't a completion requirement, I probably would have stopped doing it after a while, but I don't regret the Galmon grabbing I did throughout the course of the story content. But while shooting for the true ending will make you play the story in a very satisfying way, once you get to the post-game and the only thing left is to mindlessly grind, it's fine to stop because the true ending really doesn't meaningfully improve things. While the series does canonically continue from the true ending, you won't miss any important story if you just get the standard ending and do the post-game story content. Now that we've spent a half hour just talking about gameplay, you should all know by now that it's not an ads video without nerdy writing talk. So let's get into the story of Rance VI. Be wary of spoilers from this point forward. Rance VI, The Collapse of Zeth is, as you might have guessed, the arc of the Rance story that focuses on Rance's adventures in the magic kingdom of Zeth. It actually doesn't have all that much in common with the Zeth segment of Kichikuou Rance outside of general socio-political and world-building stuff, plus a number of characters from Kichikuou do show up in 6. So in the Rance universe, Zeth is a nation that operates on a strict hierarchy based on magic. Namely, mages are in charge, and non-mages are the oppressed grunts of society and are literally known as second-class citizens. And there's all sorts of corruption and debauchery to go along with it, and systemic stuff in place designed to make it very hard for second-class citizens to elevate themselves into first class. Rance and Sill make their way there, and Rance naturally ends up pissing off someone in power. Sill, being a skilled mage, is treated quite well and is almost immediately introduced to some of the Zethian high society. Meanwhile, Rance, who despite literally being able to learn magic in Rance 5D, is not a mage, and is therefore forced to compete in monster-based blood sports alongside a bunch of other second-class citizens. Since Rance is canonically OP, he manages to escape with the help of a dude named Abert alongside a dude named Rocky, who is so grateful for the rescue that he becomes a Rance simp. Eventually, they link up with an organized group of resistance fighters known as Ice Flame, who want to overthrow the magic order and reforge Zeth into an egalitarian society where everyone is treated equally under the law and is given equal opportunity based on their merits. Rance naturally doesn't give a shit about any of that, but he's pissed at the Zethian mages for locking him up, and despite his assertions otherwise, he really wants Sill back. So he joins up with Ice Flame, partly because by doing so he can utilize their numbers to achieve his goals, and partly because there are a number of cute girls among the freedom fighters. Priorities. The story of Rance VI does do some interesting things, both in terms of an interesting plot, but also on the more technical writing side of things. So most of the individual plot points don't actually matter all that much. There are of course introductions to important characters and a few big events that do matter a lot, but a lot of it is actually, I hesitate to use this term because it has a negative connotation, but that's not how I mean it. But it's honestly filler. It doesn't exactly push the plot forward, but it maintains its tempo and allows for a bit of distance between some of the major plot elements. For me, I really like talking about story structure and all that good stuff, but I honestly don't think there's a whole lot to dissect from that lens. On a structural level, it's really just a few major plot points buffered by a bunch of exciting but ultimately inconsequential plot points. But of course, there's also a lot of character-focused stuff going on as well. It's Rance after all. Were you expecting any less? But with the character stuff, I'm also faced with a bit of a dilemma. I think it's all great stuff, but it's very difficult to talk about most of it given my style of video, because a lot of it really boils down to being about the vibes. And I hate having to fall back on such a subjective and abstract concept, but it's true. The character work in Rance VI, outside of a handful of dedicated character arcs that I will discuss later in the video, is really as supplementary as it gets. They have comedy and H scenes naturally, but they're also really meant to make you feel like Rance is surrounded by real interesting people. It's designed to make you feel like the Ice Flame camp is alive and that Rance is one part of a greater overall world. But don't tell him that. Now, I could just go over the plot beat by beat and pad the ever-loving fuck out of this video, but I just don't like that. Instead, I'll go over the major stuff, skipping over parts that don't matter in the grand scheme of things. Then I'll talk about some of the interesting things I liked and disliked about the story. This summary is gonna take a while, but trust me, I'm removing and condensing a lot of unnecessary bits. So Rance and Rocky escape the blood sports arena with the help of a dude named Abert, who is an important figure in Ice Flame. At the camp, Rance bullies his way into getting his own squad. The important characters here are the leader Urza, a woman in a wheelchair who is very clearly going through some self-worth issues. Daniel is an old man and Abert's father. We also meet Kaoru, who is a returning character from Kichikuou Rance. Additionally, Ice Flame runs a makeshift orphanage, taking in children who've had bad shit happen to their families as a result of Zeth just kinda being awful. This is run by a woman named Kimchi. As the story goes on, a big portion of the events end up being Rance and his group going on missions that help the second-class citizens of Zeth, typically to the annoyance of the mages. For example, at one point they take down a serial killer who exclusively targets non-mages. Another time, they destroy a bunch of what are essentially vending machine loan sharks. They lend people money and put a curse on them that activates if they don't pay in time. Oh, and they charge a 0.3% daily compounding interest rate. Okay, quick tangent. I know that 0.3% does not sound like a lot, but that applies every single day and ends up being a 185.16% APY. For reference, credit cards, which if you hold a balance for longer than a month ends up being pretty much the most expensive loan you can get outside of payday loans and organized crime, typically have an APY of 20 to 30%. And again, that's generally considered a very high interest rate for a loan. Seriously, don't hold a balance on a credit card, and if you have credit card debt, pay it the fuck off as soon as humanly possible. I just needed to hammer home how fucking awful these loan machines are because Zeth is basically a country run by comic book supervillains. And yes, I'm aware that real-life payday loans often have even higher interest rates. I don't think too highly of them either. Okay, back on track. In addition to helping the local populace, Rance is reunited with Sill as well as Sanakia, the night girl from Rance 4. Over time, Rance also teams up with Shizuka, Kanami, Maria, Rizna, and Kopandon, who are all significant characters from previous games. Quick note about Zeth's political structure. Zeth is a monarchy ruled by King Ragnarok Arc Super Gandhi, who's a bit goofy but nowhere near as fun as his Kichikuou Rance iteration. He's almost always accompanied by his subordinates Kaoru, who infiltrated Ice Flame, and Wichita. King Gandhi's ideals actually align with Ice Flame, and he wants to do right by his subjects. However, despite being the reigning king, he alone cannot completely upend the societal structure. So he wanders around as a vigilante known as Punisher Mito, and he does his best to cause trouble for those mages who go too far in their sadistic degeneracy, which is a lot of them to be fair. Beneath the king himself is the four lords who have two primary responsibilities. They directly oversee the bureaucrats who do the busy work to run the country, and they each have a tower on the perimeter of the nation's capital that serve as powerful defensive structures. The lords each manage their defenses of their tower and will take on a military commander role should they ever be attacked. The four lords are the de facto rulers of Zeth and can only be overruled by the king himself. At the time of Rance VI, the four lords are Magic the Gandhi, who is the daughter of King Gandhi, Chizuko Yamada, who dresses gaudily and that's her entire deal, Nagi Suragarl, who I'll talk about later, and Papaya Server, who was driven insane by the cursed book she carries known as the Namicon. Magic and Chizuko are generally decent people. Papaya is evil due to her insanity, and Nagi has her own goals and doesn't really care about her role one way or another. Naturally, Rance has dealings with these four throughout the course of the story. Okay, back to the main story. Rance and co. end up meeting and recruiting one of the last of the insect users, a culture that gains special abilities by taking insects into their bodies and forming a symbiotic relationship. There's a lot of bigotry against them, and they've mostly all been wiped out. The girl they rescue is named Kaloria, who is objectively protected at all costs level. She doesn't do a whole lot story-wise, though she's exceptionally adorable, a very good offensive support unit, and appears in several games after this one, so I assume she's gonna be somewhat important eventually, so I figured I'd at least mention her. Ice Flame also has to deal with another resistance organization known as Pentagon. These guys are also going against the established order, but they're basically just terrorists who want to reverse things so that the non-mages are above the mages. Some of Rance's objectives include interfering with their plans where they would be excessively harmful to civilians. Though at the same time, it's not uncommon for each group's activities to help the others, seeing as they're both fighting against the government. This continues for some time. Eventually, Rance meets and recruits Patton, who is actually the antagonist of Rance 3. There's political stuff going on in Helmand, and he kind of left to wander and train and shit. Turns out he's actually kinda decent, so he joins up. Oh, and along the way, there are periodic fights with a weak character called Dark Rance, who was the result of Rance banging Felis while she was on her flux back in Rance 5D. That whole thing is funny, but I'm actually interested to see how it develops in the future. Ice Flame eventually ends up getting to the point where they can start causing real problems, and they end up messing with a bunch of high-ranking mages up to and including the four lords themselves. So now I've got to explain some more stuff. Bordering Zeth is the land where the fiends rule. If you've watched my previous Rance videos, I've referred to them as demons and dark lords, but that's because different translators worked on the retro games. Here they're called fiends, so that's what I'll call them now. Fiends will live forever as long as nothing outright kills them. Even the weakest ones are incredibly powerful, and they also have a built-in magical shield that protects them from physical attacks and can only be pierced by another fiend or a handful of legendary weapons. The fiends rule over the monsters in the area. Zeth is protected by a magically powered border wall known as the Majino line. It has a bunch of magical defenses that'll basically zap the shit out of anything that comes near. It's an extreme strain on Zeth's economy, but a necessary one. All mages are required to contribute magical power on a regular basis to top up the supply feeding the line. This power is stored in ancient mana batteries. These things are a state secret and it's known how to use them, but they have yet to figure out how to recreate them, as they were made during the golden age of magic. Watch my Rance 4 video if you want to know more about that. Okay, that's what you need to know for this next part. I know I've just been recapping the plot for a while now, but trust me, I am condensing and skipping over a lot. I really want to talk about my opinions already, but I need to get this on the table first. Oh, also, Rance ends up recruiting the nun Sill and reclaiming the Dark Sword Chaos, which is one of the only things that can allow a mortal to harm a fiend. Rance ends up using this to kill the fiend Sieg in a tough boss fight that ends in a really funny way. I'm not going to spoil that one, play the game for yourself. So, through a combination of a temporary truce/alliance with Pentagon and some fiend meddling, Rance destroys a bunch of the mana batteries, forcing Zeth's mages to immediately drop what they're doing and put all their attention into maintaining the line. This is something they're legally obligated to do, though they never expected to actually have to do it. This provides a perfect opportunity for the second-class citizens to riot with no resistance. This completely destabilizes the entire fucking nation, and then we get some M. Night Shyamalan twists. While this is all going down, the fiend-led monsters invade. Boss Lady Fiend is Camilla. She's kind of the one directing things. However, it turns out that Abert was actually an apostle to Camilla. Apostles are the servants of fiends. Not even remotely on the same level, but pretty tough and they don't age. But he wasn't aware of this because centuries ago he took a magical bukkake that gave him amnesia. The reason Rance is learning all this is because when Abert finally reunited with Camilla, he regained his memories and went on a villain monologue. But while he had no memories, his magical bond with Camilla left him with only the memory of having once served a beautiful and ridiculously powerful woman. This compelled him to go out in search of someone to fill that role, even if they weren't necessarily the same person. When he would find a woman who was beautiful and seemingly strong-willed, he would put them through a trial that basically involved traumatizing them in some way. When they inevitably failed to just shrug it off, he would discard them and search for another. He did this to many women, but we end up learning about 3 in particular. First was Rizna. The reason she was trapped in that magical prison back in 5D was because of him. She failed. Second was Papaya, one of the 4 lords. He's the one that gave her the Nomicon which drove her insane. She failed. And most recently, Urza. When she originally formed Ice Flame after disassociating with Pentagon, Abert helped out. Eventually, he tested her by sabotaging an Ice Flame mission which resulted in the authorities murdering her family. The trauma of this gave her psychosomatic paraplegia. She kept leading Ice Flame out of a sense of obligation, but she was very clearly not her old self, so Abert wasn't entirely sure if she passed or failed. But after a year, she hadn't recovered. She failed. The only reason Abert stuck around was at the request of Daniel, who it turns out is not Abert's father, but his son. It's just that he aged and Abert didn't. They did develop a bit of a bond, so to make Daniel happy, Abert stayed with Ice Flame until he could find another woman to test. Meanwhile, there was also a whole bunch of plot stuff involving the monster invasion where Ice Flame had to simultaneously fight monsters, protect the relatively innocent mages who were at risk of getting lynched, and try to mount some kind of organized defense. At this point, the government has effectively collapsed, and Ice Flame gained the support of the decent people in Zeth's upper crust, including King Gandhi, Magic, and Alex. I know I haven't mentioned Alex yet, but he's the guy who would have been Magic's love interest if Rance had not done Rance things. During this time, Urza finally regains her self-confidence and manages to stand on her own 2 feet once again and coming into her own as a capable and strong leader. Back to Abert. He kinda made this whole testing people his entire personality. So when he was reunited with Camilla, he didn't just fall back into her servitude. Instead, after some time, he wanted to test her, though he was sure she would pass. And just for clarity, I'm skipping over a lot of plot details here, including a bit where Rance gets captured by Camilla and has his life spared until he's eventually rescued because his insane narcissism amused her. It was funny, but not super important. Abert murdered Camilla's other apostle, Reincock, who Camilla cared for greatly. Side note, I'm actually kind of annoyed that Reincock died in 6. He was such a fun character in Kichikuou Rance, and I'd hoped he would serve a much bigger role in the canon timeline. But in any case, Reincock's death seriously threw Camilla off her game, and in her emotionally turbulent state, Rance and co are able to seal her away. She failed. Around this time, they're also able to restore the Maginot Line and detonate a bomb that only affects monsters to clear out the majority of the invading army and force them to retreat. Abert eventually decides that instead of looking for just one perfect woman to serve, he would instead look for multiple women with exceptional individual traits and make them his. So he eats the blood soul of Sieg, that's the thing that's left behind when a fiend is killed, and becomes a fiend himself, or at least something akin to one. He recruits a mage named Annis as his first apostle. Annis is a fun character. She's one of the most powerful mages in the world, but she's also a complete dumbass and she's just as likely to hurt her allies as her enemies. I like her. But Abert doesn't particularly care about the invasion, so once Camilla falls, he fucks off for a bit. In the aftermath, Zeth shifts his priorities towards rebuilding both physically and societally. Papaya and Nagi are replaced by Urza and another guy named Chochoman, though we never actually see him in this game. So now the Lords are an even balance of mages and non-mages. So while Zeth still has a way to go, the immediate conflict is resolved. There is some post-game story, but it mostly involves tying up loose ends. Rance needs to do a variety of things like stamp out the remnants of Pentagon, deal with Papaya as she's still causing problems, and a few side quests to meet characters who were referenced earlier, but Rance just hadn't had a chance to snuggle them yet. Oh, and he has a confrontation with Abert, who serves as Rance VI's primary superboss story-wise, though as I discussed earlier, there are a number of superbosses who aren't important to the narrative. So now that the recap is finally over, you might be a little disappointed to hear this, but there really isn't that much to say, at least in regards to the main story itself. Structurally, it's actually pretty formulaic. It's a pretty standard 3-act story split up over 6 chapters, with a twist that initiates a surprise 3rd-act conflict. While the formulaic nature of the story does not make it bad in the slightest, it does leave me with not a whole lot to talk about in terms of the actual writing. It pretty much just did its job. What I will say is that Rance VI has some interesting implications for the overall story of Rance. This was the first instance in the modern canon where the fiends really started doing things, and this was really the first major act of war against the humans in a long time. So it sets up that the tension is building and things are about to start happening with them. There's also the fact that a major political change has happened with the world, with one of the major powers of the continent literally collapsing. Though it is being rebuilt, it will never be the same, and that will change things on a global scale. And of course, Rance is now ingratiated with the leadership of Zeth, and even besides that, he's got a lot of influence due to the antics he got up to with Iceflame. And of course, it pushed some character stories along and introduced more fun characters who I'm sure will stick around in some capacity in future games. But beyond that, the main story isn't really doing all that much, at least not that a writing nerd like myself can pick apart. But before we move on to the stuff that I really did like about the story of Rance VI, I do have to discuss the 2 endings. The initial ending is available after beating Camilla and seeing the credits roll for the first time. Essentially, Rance just decides to take Sill and fuck off because he's kinda bored with the place. All the loose ends he neglected to tie up end up working themselves out regardless. The true ending, which let me remind you requires a ton of busy work, is basically the same at its core. Rance gets bored, takes Sill, and fucks off. However, the loose ends are already tied up, and he has a short goodbye dialogue with a bunch of the cast. It's a nice send-off, but a paltry reward for the amount of effort that goes into it. Where Rance VI's story shines is where every Rance story shines, the character interactions and the comedy. I know I haven't talked about it all that much yet, but this game does not disappoint on that front. So yeah, the game is fucking funny. Rance is the same narcissistic, psychopathic tsundere that we all know and love. While he plays himself off as a gallant hero, he's of course a total asshole, committing his first struggle snuggle a few minutes into the game. I think the fastest we've seen that happen yet. He has amazing back and forth banter with Shizuka, which is great because she's a character who simultaneously actually doesn't like him at this point, and is powerful enough to do something about that. So for a significant portion of the game, Rance is trying to figure out a way to fuck her and failing at every step. You know, until he doesn't. At one point he tries to break into her room, only to trip the magical trap she'd set up, leading to one of my favorite CGs in the entire series. I'll show a censored version of it here, but seeing Rance get the ever-loving shit zapped out of him is just hilarious, as is the fact that you can see an electrified outline of his dick. At one point, Rance gets absolutely blindsided by encountering a woman. Only this woman was ugly. And not only that, it's soon revealed that this woman is actually transgender. Rance then drops a couple of gamer words and is just fucking traumatized. Meanwhile, all the girls in the party are in the background absolutely losing their shit. Even Sill is laughing, and she never laughs at Rance. During the scene where they're detonating the monster bomb, Rance makes Sill do it, and I mean, just look at this CG. And of course, I can't talk about the funny shit this game gets up to without mentioning one of the funniest scenes I've seen out of Rance so far. In fact, this might just be my new favorite. So while Rance is doing his thing with Iceflame, they end up finding a machine that lets people swap bodies. Sanakia is there having been swapped with a Yankee, which is one of the varieties of monster. Now, the logical thing to do would be to swap them back and be on their way. Nope, Rance gets curious and ends up swapping with Sanakia's body. So now Rance is in Sanakia's body, Sanakia is in the Yankee's body, and the Yankee is in Rance's body. The Yankee then immediately proceeds to start struggle-snuggling Rance, and holy fuck is it funny. Rance is absolutely indignant, the party is in shock, and Sanakia is very torn. On the one hand, she's happy that Rance is finally getting a taste of her own medicine. On the other, that's her body, and she's gonna be the one feeling it the next day. And meanwhile, Rance is also having his one singular moment of self-awareness saying shit like, "Is this what I've been doing to people? Man, I'm an asshole." Of course, once he's out of peril, he completely forgets about this moment of enlightenment. I got so much enjoyment out of this scene, you have no fucking idea. It absolutely made my day. Look, in my Rance videos, I always like to pick my favorite funny scene from each game and share it with you. I am never able to truly do them justice, and the same is true for this one. This scene is ridiculously hilarious, and you need to experience it for yourself. Another thing I appreciated about Rance 6 is that it had a surprising number of references to Kichikuou Rance. It's pretty much all found in the side stories and little comedic scenes, and you don't actually need to have played Kichikuou to enjoy them. But if you have, you'll get more out of them. For example, the scene from Kichikuou where Rance runs into a ghost girl and provides her with erotic literature makes a return in 6. Only this time, Rance actually finds a way to fuck her. Or the absolutely amazing Sill turns into a cow scene. So in Kichikuou Rance, there's an event that can happen if you make Leah jealous of Sill where she'll put a curse on her, transforming into this unicorn-like thing that the game just calls a cow. There's the whole process to turn her back, and it's actually one of my favorite side quests from that game. Of course, you can also cut it short by selling cow Sill to the merchant who ends up eating her. Yeah. Well, in Rance 6, there's a scene that I immediately caught as a reference, and I had assumed they essentially recreated something similar to that scene and mentally prepared myself to be without Sill for a while, because she is a very useful unit in combat. But my fears were unfounded, because Rance instead just threw Sill into the barn with the cows and pretended she was one, while she's all like, "Master Rance, can I stop pretending to be a cow now?" He's just such a dick, and it's a funny scene made even funnier by my experience with Kichikuou Rance, and it's yet another reason why I think you shouldn't skip that game in your own Rance journey. Now look, with Rance 5D, I maintain that the humor is the saving grace of that game and makes it worth a pickup. But Rance 6 really does step it up, and it just goes to show how much more the team was on the ball for 6 after the absolute shit show that was the development cycle for 5D. When I think back on my time with Rance 6's story, of course I do think of the funny bits and the lore implications, but what I really remember is the genuinely amazing character moments and the stories that arise from them. Let's take Rocky for example. I know I kinda memed on him, and yeah, he is a short king who simps for Rance out of gratitude, but he's actually a fascinating character in his own right. He's a genuinely pleasant person who pretty quickly ends up befriending most of Ice Flame and becomes almost a parental figure for the children. But for most of the game, he maintains a lingering bigotry. Due to his experience as a second-class citizen, he fucking hates mages. So he actually acts like a bit of a dick to Sill, and it's one of those things where it almost feels like an out-of-character moment, but it also completely makes sense. He's a good person who got mistreated by members of a certain demographic, and as a result, he's incredibly prejudiced against all the members of that demographic. And as a result of that, he takes it out on somebody who very much doesn't deserve it, and is in fact fighting to overturn the system that caused his mistreatment in the first place. Sill genuinely believes in the Ice Flame cause. As much as she would be there regardless due to her Rance-induced Stockholm Syndrome, she feels good about the work they're doing. But Rocky lashes out at her, and Sill, being the sweetheart that she is, eventually ends up Daryl Davising him into rethinking his mindset, and he eventually apologizes to her. Which she obviously accepts because she's probably the nicest person in the Rance universe. And I really liked that whole arc. It was told entirely through little side scenes, but it felt really human and really touching. And I also liked how it was able to happen without Rance being the focal point. It made these two feel like their own independent characters who have their own things going on, and as much as I've liked the stories of all the Rance games up to this point, none of them have ever really accomplished that on a character level. 4 made the world feel real, but that's a separate thing to me. And of course, it continues with Sill's established character, and if you've played the previous games, you're not surprised that she forgives Rocky so easily. After all, she forgave Konami back in 4 for trying to literally murder her, and she forgave Rizna for trying to put her into what's essentially immortal solitary confinement. She's just a very forgiving person, and it's nice to see that kind of character consistency beyond the surface level tropes. Shizuka also got a significant continuation of her story arc. All the way back in Rance 2, we've seen that she has this obsession with gaining magical power at any cost to be able to go back in time to prevent the death of her parents. Though over time, we do also see that get tinged with a desire for revenge against the man who caused those deaths. and a lot of Rance's interactions with her involve him interrupting her search, taking the cursed ring from her in 2, and snuggling her while she was in the middle of a ritual in 4. Well, in 6, we finally get to learn all the stuff that really went down. See, Shizuka's parents were both powerful mages who studied alongside Rajasis from the second game and a man named Shenazal Doragaro. I'm probably mispronouncing that, I don't care. They were all evenly matched, and when they sparred, none could overcome any of the others. Eventually, Shizuka's parents got together, and Shenazal, who had a thing for Shizuka's mother, kinda lost it. He got all stalky, and they ran away and had Shizuka. Later, he challenges Shizuka's father to a duel, but ambushes him and kills them. Then proceeds to... yeah, I can't call it a struggle snuggle when Rance himself isn't involved. He kidnaps and rapes Shizuka's mother, who ends up giving birth to Nagi Suragaro, who would eventually become one of the 4 lords. Shizuka's mother eventually takes her own life, and Shenazal goes even more insane. When he learns of Shizuka's existence, he views it as a way to really show dominance over his old rival and subjects Nagi to intense and sadistic training as well as sexual abuse for the purposes of making it so she could one day kill Shizuka. Well, in Rance 6, that confrontation finally happens. Shizuka and Nagi face off with a thoroughly insane Shenazal watching, who is being kept alive in a tube with magic and technology because he's old and completely fucked up his body. But it turns out that when he saw a picture of Shizuka for the first time, he sees that she looks just like her mother, and his entire mindset flips and he wants her as a daughter, not as a rival. But of course, Shizuka's death was literally drilled into Nagi as the reason for her existence, so she'd been ignoring his instructions and tried to kill her anyway. She ends up getting the upper hand on Shizuka and does just a little bit of sexual torture before Rance and co come to the rescue, and Rance kills Shenazal outright. Despite being thoroughly abused by him, Nagi had an intense love for her father, so this drives her even more insane, and she swears vengeance on Shizuka, who just ends up feeling sorry for her. At the end of the day, Shizuka's like, that's my sister, and she's been fucked over by the same man who ruined my life. I can't hate her. So after 5 mainline titles in the series, Shizuka gets some closure, and she gets to actually have another leg to her story moving forward. And I don't know what that will be exactly, but I'm excited to see it play out. And we do also see how Shizuka has grown over time. The Shizuka of Rance 2 would not have been so sympathetic towards Nagi. Hell no. She'd probably be like, I'm gonna kill that bitch. But after going through her own struggles and seeing quite frankly how miserable it made her, gave her a new perspective on things. Also, it seems like she's finally starting to warm to Rance just a tiny bit, so she might actually be interpreting the world in a slightly more positive way than before. I also need to talk just a bit about Urza because I'm aware that I've neglected her in this video. There's a lot that goes into her, and she's a profoundly likable person even when she's at her worst. When we first meet her, she's basically a broken person as a result of Abert's trial, and we quickly learn from Daniel that the only reason she can't walk is because she really doesn't believe she can or is worthy of it. Rance is very quickly able to take control over her, using her for sex and effectively leading Ice Flame by proxy. And for a while, we see some conflicting emotions from her. She certainly doesn't appreciate Rance's behavior, but her self-esteem is low enough that she just accepts it. And when Rance, who despite being an overall dumbass, is a highly capable warrior, starts finding real success in the field, more than Ice Flame ever has before, she starts to ask herself if she should just let go and give Rance the responsibility she no longer feels she deserves to hold. But over time, we start to see how much everyone else loves and respects her, and most of them are extremely grateful for all her efforts both before and after the incident. And there are these little moments where she has to act like a leader, and people do rely on her. But when the shit all hits the fan, and Zeth is being attacked by monsters, Pentagon is powerful, and everything's getting destroyed, she's put under pressure, and it's basically yet another trial. But she passes. Like, she's playing Darkest Dungeon and rolled that virtue chance when her stress capped out. She stands on her own 2 feet, grabs a sword and a gun, and she is ready to go. And let me tell you, it's a fucking travesty that this moment didn't get an accompanying CG. But from then on, she really starts taking charge and coordinates the refugee operations alongside the Gandhis and everyone else. She starts turning down Rance's requests for sex. Eventually, she would even become one of the new 4 lords and take a direct role in leading the country. Such a great overall character arc, and let me tell you, it was probably the most inspiring part of this game. And it also doesn't hurt that she's a really fun character in combat. And one story that was relatively minor in the grand scheme of things, featuring a minor character who has a grand total of 4 paragraphs on her page on the Alicesoft wiki, ended up being something that stuck with me as some of the best writing in this game. And this comes from a character who doesn't speak, or if she ever did, it was only a few words tops. I can't remember for sure. So as I mentioned way earlier, Ice Flame has a makeshift orphanage. It's run by a woman named Kimchi, who was one of the original members of Ice Flame and took it upon herself to help the disenfranchised children of Zeth, especially those who were displaced by the conflict between the mages and the resistance fighters like Ice Flame and Pentagon. Early on in the game, you meet 2 of these orphans, but I really want to focus on one in particular. A 7-year-old girl named Alfra. She's immediately characterized as quiet, shy, and afraid of men. She even runs away from Rocky, who just exudes a friendly aura that tends to put people at ease. And prominently, one of her eyes is covered by a bandage, so it's clear that she's been through some shit. Over time, Rance will occasionally have little interactions with her. Not much changes and she's still afraid of him, but, and I may be looking into this a bit too much, they do develop a kind of tentative rapport. Rance tends to actually behave himself when talking to her. And this is also a good character moment for Rance as well. Rance in the canon timeline has a soft spot for children. Doesn't stop him from occasionally being a dick to them, but he looks out for their well-being, and despite his protests, I think he likes them. It's also notable that children are one of only 2 categories of female that he will not have sex with specifically for moral and ethical reasons, with the other character being blood relatives, as revealed in Rance 01. And he proves this by rejecting one of the other orphans, Karma, who aggressively tries to seduce him, even to the point of crawling into bed with him naked. Side note, Karma's great, just look at this little gremlin. Now, I'm not saying that we should be heaping praise on Rance for not diddling kids, but the fact that he has a moral line is pretty huge. So what do you think happens when Rance is talking to Kimchi and he learns that before coming to Ice Flame, Alfra was originally living in an establishment known as the Lolita House, which takes in second-class children who have been abandoned by their parents? I don't think I have to explain what kind of business this is, and I won't because I'd like to keep this video monetized. To be clear, this is very much illegal in Zeth, and even with all the degeneracy that takes place with the higher-ups in Magical Society, and trust me, there's a lot of that, if the existence of this place became common knowledge, there would be serious backlash from a decent chunk of the mages. But in addition to being a very well-kept secret, the Lolita House exclusively serves first-class citizens of the extremely wealthy variety and charges through the nose for its services. These people have power and an interest in protecting the place, so they make sure it stays under the radar. While there are rules in regards to treatment of the children, all can be forgiven through payment of a hefty fine, so it's not uncommon for people to go overboard. This is presumably how Alfra lost her eye. Rance learns about this, and he gets fucking pissed. More than at any other point in the game. Even more than we see when someone is endangering Sill, and believe me, he gets pissed when someone threatens Sill. He immediately rounds up the squad, and you unlock the Lolita House as a quest dungeon. Rance goes in and absolutely fucks shit up. He kills every adult he comes across, both staff and clients. He of course rescues as many children as he can find. And interestingly, Rance just can't admit to himself or anyone else that he cares about the kids being hurt or that he's acting out of any sense of altruism, even though that's the logical thing here. But since Rance just can't bring himself to say that he's doing a good thing for someone other than himself, he rationalizes it as, how dare you hurt my future women? So he's not cool with child abuse, but I guess he's okay with grooming? Whatever, he's just huffing copium, it's progress. Rance also kills the house's madam, a horrific looking woman named Miss Minchin, who is actually the first woman Rance kills in the canon timeline. While he has absolutely no aversion to struggle snuggling every hole he comes across, he actually never takes female lives. He does kill a woman in Kichikuou, but that's non-canon. He takes a crystal that Minchin always wore and burns the place to the ground. When he returns to Ice Flame, he gives the crystal to Alfra and explains that she's dead and can never hurt her again. Then, in a really powerful scene, Alfra shows more emotion than we've ever seen from her and smashes the crystal with a rock, continuing well beyond the point where it's basically just dust and sobbing all the while. And from then on, every time we saw her, we can see her warming up to Rance and coming out of her shell. Not entirely, mind you, but she becomes a lot more comfortable around Rance, and we start to see her be a little more happy than before. And she also starts to be a bit more okay with Rocky, albeit to a much lesser extent. By the way, Rocky had become close with Kimchi, and he found that he enjoyed helping out at the orphanage, and the kids like him. Alfra's not quite there yet because she still has those scars, but she's definitely moving in that direction. Alfra is a character who, again, is very minor. Shows up once in a while as essentially the visual version of flavor text. The focal point of her existence in the story is a single quest. She doesn't show up in any of the future games, though the artist Orion assures us she had a happy ending. She doesn't even fucking talk. But I think she has some of the best character writing in the game. You can really see the complicated emotions she deals with and how her fucked up past influenced the person she is today. She's just so very believable as a sweet little kid who had the worst kind of upbringing. If you haven't played this game, definitely give it a shot for her. It's hard to really explain the effectiveness of passive characterization without you experiencing it for yourself. So what can I say about Rance VI's writing? Look, I love the Rance games and I love the writing of these games, but on a technical level, it's just not as impressive as some things I've read. While there's always been interesting plot things going on, structurally, it's all very straightforward. but it's also a unique experience that you really can't get anywhere else. It's got a great blend of rip-roaring comedy, serious world building, strong characters, and even touches on some serious and dark subjects, giving them the gravity that they deserve. And of course, Rance himself is entertaining in any setting. He is, as always, someone who is absolutely awful, but has that hilarious charisma and childlike outlook on the world, and you can't help but like him. And we do get some character development here. He's not the same Rance we met back in Rance 1, and the plot itself really started kicking forward in a meta sense. Back when I originally played Rance 3, I said, oh man, things are finally kicking into gear, and I had no idea what I was talking about. The stuff with the Fiends now is actually starting to kick into gear, and I am certain they will be the existential threat that the rest of the series has to contend with. I am excited. So overall, Rance 6 is a pretty solid game. Not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but it has a fun core gameplay loop with a lot to do and some pretty quality writing. Of course, I do strongly encourage applying the TADA Patch because it fixes so much that was wrong with the release version of the game. But while I do have my complaints here and there, I have to say that Rance 6 is my favorite of the series so far. Look, the story of Rance 3 and 4 was great. The gameplay of Kichikuou Rance was phenomenal. I appreciated the irreverence of 5D even, but Rance 6 is the first game that I feel is pretty much the complete package. This game absolutely slaps, and it gets my recommendation 100%. I would link it in the description, but I don't trust that linking to the R18 section of Manga Gamer's website won't get me a community guideline strike. But nonetheless, Rance 6 The Collapse of Zeth was a great time. Next up, Sengoku Rance. Thanks for watching. Big thank you to my channel members, especially my $10 member, Bulk Squat Thrust. They got to see this video a couple days early. If you'd like to watch my stuff before the unwashed masses get a hold of it, consider joining for as low as 99 cents a month. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. Believe it or not, it really does help. I got some good stuff coming up in the future. Obviously, the Sengoku Rance video will happen eventually. No ETA because I haven't played the actual game yet. I've also got some heavy-duty videos on the Mushoku Tensei light novels in the works as well. I'll be doing a full critique of the entire series, and it will be the most in-depth writing analysis I've ever done on this channel. And of course, I'll still have other eroge and visual novel content coming your way too. Once again, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.